This is the war where kingdoms starved themselves to ashes. Where cities that had stood for centuries became smoke and bones. Where religion, power, and greed carved rivers of blood across Europe. It was a conflict so vast, so brutal, that entire generations were lost, swallowed whole by famine, fire, and plague. This was the 30 Years' War, Europe's bloodiest conflict. The battlefield lies silent now. The wind whispers across frozen fields where the snow is black with soot. A cannon lies overturned, its barrel cracked, half buried in mud. Crows circle above the bodies of men who only hours ago screamed, prayed, cursed, and fought for lives that ended in the dirt. The air stinks of powder and charred wood. The taste of ash clings to the tongue. Here and there, flames lick at ruined wagons, and the faint cry of a wounded soldier breaks the stillness, fading quickly into nothing. This is Europe in the first decades of the 17th century, a land choking on its own ambitions. The 30 Years' War was not one single battle. It was not one single cause. It was a storm, unleashed across Central Europe, devouring states, cities, and people without mercy. The war would rage for 3 decades, pulling kings, generals, and peasants alike into its inferno. And when it ended, the continent would be changed forever. But to understand the scale of its horror, you must first step into the boots of those who lived it. Imagine you are a young farmer, ripped from your village by men in a lord's colors. You are handed a pike taller than yourself and ordered to march. You do not know where or why. You only know that your family will starve without you, and that the men around you look as terrified as you feel. The road stretches for miles. Mud sucks at your feet. The officers shout at you in a language not your own. For in this war, armies are patchworks of mercenaries. Swedes, Spaniards, Bohemians, Italians, Hungarians, bound not by loyalty, but by coin. Some march for faith, but most march simply to eat. And when the drums finally stop, you are thrown into the chaos of battle. The clash of steel deafens you. Musket fire spits clouds of smoke so thick you can't see your enemy, only hear the cries of the dying. The heat, the fear, the smell of blood, it is overwhelming. And then the line breaks. The cavalry charges, and all is slaughter. If you survive, you are driven onward to the next village, the next campaign, the next season of hunger. If you fall, no priest will bury you. The earth itself will take you, and the war will move on, leaving your bones behind. This is what the 30 Years' War meant for the common man. Not glory, not honor, but survival. And yet, behind every shattered village and every starving soldier, there were decisions made in courts, palaces, and churches that dragged millions into this abyss. Europe stood on the edge of transformation. The old order of empires and dynasties trembled. Religion split nations apart. Ambition sharpened its knives. One spark, one act, would ignite the greatest inferno the continent had ever known. And once it began, there would be no stopping it. But before the fire came, the storm was gathering. And in that gathering storm, the seeds of 30 years of horror were planted.
The year is 1617. Europe is a continent divided. Its map is a mosaic of kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, and free cities, stitched together by fragile treaties and ancient rivalries. To the north, the Kingdom of Sweden eyes expansion across the Baltic. To the west, the Spanish Empire still clings to its fading dominance, its galleons sailing home heavy with silver, yet its armies stretched thin. And in the very heart of the continent lies the Holy Roman Empire, vast, fragmented, and unstable. On paper, the Holy Roman Empire was a marvel, hundreds of principalities and free states united under one emperor, a Habsburg whose authority, in theory, stretched across Central Europe. In reality, it was a house of glass, cracked by religion and ambition. Protestants and Catholics eyed one another with suspicion, both waiting for the other to move first. For the Catholic Habsburgs, ruling from Vienna and Madrid, unity meant survival. Their dynasty, entwined across empires, dreamed of a Catholic Europe under their crown. But for the Protestant princes scattered across Germany, unity under Habsburg rule felt like a chain tightening around their necks. And beyond the empire's borders, kings and queens waited like vultures. France, though Catholic, hated being hemmed in by Habsburg power. Denmark, Sweden, and the Dutch Republic watched with interest, eager to seize land and influence the moment chaos erupted. This was the world's powder keg, but on the ground, far from palaces and thrones, life looked very different. A peasant in Saxony rose before dawn to tend his fields. He thought little of emperors or dynasties. His days were filled with mud, bread, and survival. The wars of kings felt like distant thunder, nothing more. A merchant in Prague counted coins and worried about trade routes, not theology. A child in a Rhineland village learned prayers in whichever church his Lord demanded. Catholic today, Lutheran tomorrow. Most did not know that their faith, their rulers, and even their homes hung by a thread. For the Reformation had split Europe a century earlier, and its wounds had never healed. Martin Luther's challenge to Rome had unleashed not just religious dissent, but political rebellion. Princes who turned Protestant saw an opportunity to weaken the emperor's grasp. Kings who backed Catholicism did so not only for faith, but for power. By 1617, the question was no longer who worshipped how. It was who would rule, and in whose name. The Holy Roman Emperor, Matthias, was aging and childless. His cousin, Ferdinand of Styria, a devout Catholic, was set to succeed him. To Protestants across Bohemia and beyond, this was no mere change of ruler. It was a threat, a man known for crushing Protestant rights, soon to wear the crown of an empire. Fear spread quietly. In taverns, whispers filled the air, of coming repression, of armies being raised. In churches, sermons grew sharper. In noble halls, alliances were drafted in ink and secrecy. And yet, across villages and towns, life went on. Markets bustled. Bells tolled for weddings. Harvests rose and fell. The common people clung to the fragile hope that the tremors of politics would not reach them. They prayed for peace. But peace was already dead. In Vienna, Ferdinand sharpened his resolve to restore Catholic power at any cost. In Prague, Protestant nobles watched, waiting for the moment to strike. In Madrid, the Spanish Habsburgs prepared to pour their armies into Germany if needed. In Paris, Cardinal Richelieu sharpened France's neck, waiting for the Habsburgs to bleed. The map of Europe in 1617 was not one of peace, but of tension disguised as stability. Every border, every alliance, every faith was a fuse waiting to be lit. And when it was lit, Europe would not see peace again for 30 years. 23, 1618. The day began like any other. Merchants opened their stalls, bells tolled in church towers, and the city's narrow streets filled with the chatter of daily life. But inside the thick stone walls of Prague Castle, history was about to take a plunge from a window. The Protestant nobles of Bohemia had grown restless. For years, they had watched with suspicion as the Catholic Habsburgs tightened their grip. Emperor Matthias was dying, and his heir, Ferdinand of Styria, was no friend to Protestants. Ferdinand believed God himself had chosen him to restore Catholic unity, and he would bend kingdoms to that vision. But Bohemia was no ordinary land. Its nobles, many of them Protestant, valued their freedoms and the right to worship as they pleased. They had fought too long, bargained too hard, to hand their faith over to a Habsburg crown without resistance. On that May morning, a delegation of Protestant lords stormed the castle. Their boots echoed on stone floors as they confronted the imperial regents, men sent by Ferdinand to enforce his will. The room grew heated. Voices rose. Accusations flew. The Protestants demanded to know why their churches were being closed, their rights trampled, their warnings ignored. The imperial representatives, arrogant and dismissive, refused to yield. And then, history turned violent. The nobles seized two of Ferdinand's regents. Shouts filled the chamber. With fury blazing in their eyes, the Protestants dragged the men to the window. Outside, the castle walls loomed 60 feet above the ground. Without hesitation, they hurled the regents into the air. The men crashed into the moat below. This act, known forever as the Defenestration of Prague, was more than rebellion. It was the spark. The message was clear: Bohemia would not bow. The regents survived the fall, landing, as Catholic chroniclers claimed, in a heap of manure. But their survival mattered little. The act itself reverberated across Europe. Within days, Bohemia erupted. Protestant nobles seized power, expelled Catholic officials, and declared their defiance. In defiance of Habsburg authority, they raised their own king, Frederick V of the Palatinate, a Protestant prince. A bold, dangerous choice. Ferdinand, now Holy Roman Emperor, saw this as nothing less than treason. He would crush Bohemia, and he would do it swiftly. The war drums began to beat. Across Europe, the great powers watched. The Spanish Habsburgs, cousins to Ferdinand, promised men and gold. Catholic Bavaria pledged its armies. Protestant Saxony hesitated, torn between loyalty to the empire and solidarity with fellow Protestants. Denmark and Sweden sharpened their swords, waiting for the moment to intervene. France, though Catholic, quietly smiled. Anything that bled the Habsburgs weakened their hold on Europe. The propaganda machines roared to life. Pamphlets, sermons, and songs painted the war in divine colors. For Catholics, this was a holy crusade to preserve the true faith. For Protestants, it was a fight for survival against tyranny. God was invoked by both sides, yet behind the banners of religion lay naked ambition, land, power, and dominance. And so, from a single window in Prague, armies began to march. The roads of Central Europe filled with mercenaries, hardened men from Italy, Wallonia, Scotland, and beyond, drawn by promises of pay and plunder. For peasants, this meant devastation. Armies were not supplied by kings, they were supplied by the land they marched through. Fields were stripped, homes looted, villages burned. Civilians, caught between Catholic and Protestant banners, learned quickly that war had no sides, only hunger and fear. As Bohemia armed itself, Ferdinand raised the imperial army under Count Tilly, a ruthless commander loyal to Catholic cause. The stage was set. The first great clash would not be long in coming. By the autumn of 1620, less than 2 years after the defenestration, Bohemia stood face to face with the might of the empire. At White Mountain, outside Prague, the fate of their rebellion would be decided. Tens of thousands gathered on that field. Drums rolled. Muskets loaded. Cavalry pawed the earth. The air trembled with the weight of what was to come. Bohemia's soldiers were ill-trained, poorly supplied, their ranks filled with reluctant farmers and mercenaries of questionable loyalty. The imperial army, by contrast, was disciplined, hardened, and backed by Spanish reinforcements. The battle lasted barely 2 hours. Imperial troops smashed through Protestant lines with terrifying speed. Panic spread. Soldiers fled. The proud rebellion of Bohemia collapsed in the mud. Prague was seized, its leaders executed, its churches reclaimed for Rome. Frederick, the so-called Winter King, fled into exile, his crown gone as quickly as the snow. The message was brutal and clear. Defy the Habsburgs, and you will be crushed. Yet rather than restore peace, White Mountain sent shockwaves across Europe. Protestant princes saw the empire's ruthlessness and realized they could be next. Catholic leaders smelled blood and pressed their advantage. And foreign powers, Denmark, Sweden, France, watched hungrily, seeing opportunities to weaken rivals and carve new empires from the ruins. The spark had become a flame, and that flame was spreading. The Bohemian revolt was crushed, but the war was only beginning. Armies were gathering, alliances shifting, and soon, all of Europe would be dragged into the fire. The smoke of White Mountain had hardly cleared before Europe realized the truth: this war would not be contained. The Habsburgs believed they had secured their empire by crushing the Bohemian revolt. Prague was subdued, Protestant leaders executed, Catholic altars restored. Yet in victory, Ferdinand and his allies sowed deeper resentment. Confiscated lands were handed to Catholic nobles. Protestant voices were silenced, their churches closed, their rights stripped away. To the Protestant world, White Mountain was not the end of rebellion, but proof that only force could defend their faith. And so, one fire fed another. Across the Holy Roman Empire, Protestant princes eyed one another with unease. Some hoped to appease Vienna, others whispered of resistance. But above them all stood one figure ready to act: Christian IV, King of Denmark. Denmark was a Protestant kingdom, and Christian IV styled himself as defender of the Protestant cause. Yet his motives were not only religious. He saw opportunity, lands in northern Germany to expand his rule, influence to gain, Habsburg power to weaken. With English and Dutch support promised in coin, he marched his armies south into the empire. The year was 1625. The war was entering a new phase. Ferdinand was ready. By his side now stood one of the most formidable figures of the conflict, Albrecht von Wallenstein. Wallenstein was no ordinary general. A wealthy Bohemian noble, he had raised his own private army, not out of loyalty, but for profit and power. His men were mercenaries, disciplined, brutal, and loyal only to the coin he provided. With Wallenstein and Count Tilly commanding Catholic forces, the imperial armies became a machine of conquest. Denmark's king soon discovered what Bohemia had already learned: the Habsburg war machine was relentless. At the Battle of Lutter in 1626, Christian IV's forces were shattered. The Danes fled north, their hopes of leading the Protestant cause destroyed. Wallenstein pursued mercilessly, pushing Danish troops back into their homeland. By 1629, Denmark was forced to make peace, humiliated and broken. The Catholics stood triumphant once again. Ferdinand's power seemed unshakable. But triumph came at a cost. Wallenstein's army, vast and hungry, consumed the land it marched across. Villages burned. Farms were stripped bare. Soldiers, unpaid and desperate, plundered with abandon. Civilians were slaughtered, starved, or left wandering as beggars. Plague followed in their wake, spreading faster than any army. For the ordinary people of Germany, there was no difference between victory and defeat. Each campaign meant more suffering. Letters from the time speak of horror. A woman from Magdeburg wrote of fields turned to wasteland, of wolves feeding on the bodies left unburied. A pastor described families roasting horseflesh to survive, children gnawing on bark and grass. In some regions, entire villages vanished, their names erased as if they had never existed. This was not war as kings imagined it. This was survival as the people endured it. And yet, even as the land bled, the war widened still. For across the Baltic, another power stirred. Sweden. Its king, Gustavus Adolphus, was unlike any monarch of his age. A brilliant strategist, a devout Protestant, and a commander who fought alongside his men, Gustavus believed his destiny was to defend the Protestant faith. But like Christian of Denmark before him, ambition also guided his hand. Sweden sought control of the Baltic trade, and a weakened Germany offered the chance. In 1630, Gustavus landed his armies on the German coast. His troops were disciplined, his tactics modern, using mobile artillery, flexible formations, and swift cavalry maneuvers that outmatched the lumbering armies of the empire. To many Protestants, he was a savior. To Ferdinand, he was a menace that threatened everything the Habsburgs had fought to secure. The clash was inevitable. In 1631, the war reached one of its darkest chapters, the sack of Magdeburg. Magdeburg, a Protestant stronghold, stood defiant against imperial forces. For months, Wallenstein's men and Tilly's troops encircled the city, starving it into submission. Inside, hunger gnawed at the people. Disease spread. Still, they refused to surrender. Then, in May, the walls were breached. What followed was one of the greatest atrocities of the war. Imperial troops poured into the city, slaughtering without mercy. Fire consumed the streets. Men, women, children, tens of thousands, were butchered. Survivors spoke of babies impaled on pikes, of churches filled with burning bodies. When the smoke cleared, Magdeburg was a blackened graveyard. Even hardened soldiers recoiled at the carnage. News spread across Europe, shocking even Catholic allies. The Magdeburg wedding, as it was grimly called, became a rallying cry for Protestants everywhere. And it was in this charred ruin that Gustavus Adolphus found his cause renewed. The Swedish king marched south, determined to strike back. At the Battle of Breitenfeld later that year, he delivered one of the most decisive Protestant victories of the war. His army crushed the imperial forces, proving that the Habsburgs could be beaten. For the first time, the war's tide shifted. Hope spread among Protestant states. Cities that had cowered rose in rebellion. Allies rallied to Sweden's banner. Gustavus was hailed as the Lion of the North, a warrior king who might save Germany from destruction. But if the war had taught Europe anything, it was this: every triumph carried its own shadow. For even as Gustavus advanced, the empire regrouped. Wallenstein returned, raising yet another vast army. The fields of Germany would once again become killing grounds. The fire was spreading faster now, hotter, more destructive. What began with a window in Prague had become a continental inferno. And Gustavus himself was marching toward a destiny that would shock the world. At Bredenfeld, the Protestants tasted victory. But the war was not finished with them. Soon, the blood of kings would stain the earth, and Germany would descend into horrors darker still. The year is 1632. Germany is no longer a land of villages and cities, it is a wasteland. The Swedish king Gustavus Adolphus has brought hope to the Protestant cause. His victory at Bredenfeld proved that imperial power could be broken, and for the first time in over a decade, Protestant armies hold the advantage. Yet with hope comes blood. For every triumph, the price is paid in fields trampled, towns burned, and bodies unburied. The war now devours all. Gustavus Adolphus marched south with fire in his eyes. His army was not only disciplined but revolutionary. He moved his cannon with speed unheard of, his cavalry cut like knives, his infantry fought in flexible lines. Against the old, rigid methods of the imperial armies, he was a storm. At the Battle of Lech, he forced imperial troops into retreat, crossing rivers under fire, his artillery roaring. Town after town opened its gates to him. Protestant states that had once cowered rallied to his banner. To many, Gustavus was not only a king but a savior, a man chosen by God to deliver Germany from Habsburg tyranny. But the empire was not broken, for Ferdinand still had Wallenstein. Wallenstein was a man as feared as he was hated. Arrogant, ambitious, wrapped in mysticism, he believed himself destined for greatness. When Ferdinand first dismissed him, jealous of his power, it seemed Wallenstein's star had fallen. But after Bredenfeld, with the empire reeling, Ferdinand had no choice. Wallenstein returned, raising yet another massive army, not out of loyalty, but for profit, prestige, and power. His soldiers, drawn from every corner of Europe, were mercenaries to the core. They marched not for faith, but for plunder. And as they moved, they consumed. Villages emptied, fields were stripped bare, families scattered to forests to escape. A German chronicler wrote, "Our people live worse than beasts. The villages are ashes, and we eat grass, dogs, and rats. Hunger drives men to madness." By 1632, famine was everywhere. Not only armies starved, entire regions withered. And where hunger ruled, disease followed. The plague returned, carried by lice, filth, and corpses left unburied. This was the true face of the 30 Years' War, not kings and crowns, but starvation, pestilence, and despair. In November 1632, the two giants finally met. Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden against Wallenstein of the Empire. The battlefield, a fog-shrouded plain near the town of Lutzen. At dawn, cannon thunder shook the mist. Swedish drums rolled, their lines advancing through the haze. Muskets spat fire. Cavalry thundered across frozen ground. The roar was endless, the fog filled with screams and smoke. Gustavus himself rode into the fray, his white horse a beacon amid the chaos. He fought not as a distant king but as a soldier among soldiers. His presence drove his men forward. But fate is cruel. In the heart of the battle, Gustavus became separated from his guard. Musket balls tore into him. Struck again and again, the Lion of the North fell, his body trampled in the mud. When word spread, his soldiers wept but did not break. With fury, they pressed on, driving Wallenstein's men back. Lutzen ended as a Protestant victory, but at a terrible price. Their king was dead. Europe shuddered. The man who might have saved Germany was gone, and with him, the dream of swift Protestant triumph. The war would continue, bloodier than ever. After Lutzen, the war changed. No longer was it a struggle of kings alone. Now, it was survival itself. Armies crisscrossed the land like locusts, consuming everything. In Württemberg, it was said 9 out of 10 villages vanished. In Hesse, parents abandoned children, unable to feed them. In Franconia, starving peasants killed deserters for their flesh. Cannibalism, once unthinkable, became whispered reality. Mercenaries grew more savage. Without pay, they looted to live. Soldiers turned on civilians, but also on each other. Mutinies broke out, camps erupted in violence. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We fight for masters who care nothing for us. Hunger is our only commander." And yet, the war machine rolled on. Ferdinand tightened Catholic control. Protestant leaders splintered, divided by distrust. Alliances shifted like sand. But the world beyond Germany was watching, waiting to strike. France, though Catholic, had no love for the Habsburgs. Surrounded by Habsburg Spain to the south and Austria to the east, France feared being strangled by the dynasty's power. Cardinal Richelieu, the cunning architect of French policy, saw his chance. In 1635, France declared war on the Habsburgs. What began as a German conflict now became a European war. French armies marched into the Rhineland. Spanish tercios clashed with French cavalry. Battles spread across the Low Countries, Italy, even the seas. The war that began with religion now burned as a struggle for dominance of the continent. For the people of Germany, this meant only more devastation. New armies, new invasions, new waves of plunder. By now, religion had faded into pretext. The 30 Years' War was about power, and civilians were its endless victims. From Magdeburg to Mainz, from Saxony to Swabia, Germany became a graveyard. Fields lay fallow, churches stood empty, whole towns vanished. Travelers spoke of wolves roaming abandoned villages, of silence where bells once rang. By the mid-1630s, some regions had lost half their people. In others, 3/4. Generations erased. The horror was not only in numbers but in memory. Survivors wrote of women carrying dead infants in rags, of men hanging from trees with signs nailed to their chests, of priests weeping in empty sanctuaries. And yet the war continued, year after year, as if no amount of death could satisfy the ambitions of kings. The earth itself seemed to groan under the weight of blood. But even in this darkness, fate had yet more twists. Armies would gamble everything in decisive battles. Alliances would fracture. And one turning point would change the very future of Europe. By the late 1630s, Europe was drowning in fire and hunger. The 30 Years' War had already claimed countless lives, yet the bloodletting had no end. Kingdoms shifted alliances, generals rose and fell, and armies marched like tides across a broken land. But even in this sea of chaos, history remembers moments, turning points where fate tilted, and the course of the war changed forever. In 1635, France, long a shadow player, finally plunged openly into the conflict. It was a gamble of enormous risk. France was Catholic, but Cardinal Richelieu, the architect of its destiny, cared little for faith. His enemy was not Protestantism, but the Habsburgs, those twin dynasties of Spain and Austria that encircled his kingdom. To break their power, France joined hands with Protestant states. French troops marched into the Rhineland, clashing with Imperial and Spanish armies. The war, once born of religion, was now nakedly political, a struggle for mastery of Europe. France brought fresh energy, fresh coin, fresh blood. Its armies swelled with mercenaries, its generals pushed into Germany, its banners clashed with Spanish tercios on battlefields from Flanders to the Alps. The struggle was no longer about who prayed to which god. It was about survival, of kingdoms, dynasties, and empires. Spain, though stretched thin, remained a fearsome power. Its tercios, veteran infantry hardened in decades of war, were still the most disciplined soldiers in Europe. Their squares of pikes and muskets had shattered armies from Italy to the Netherlands. But the Spanish Empire was bleeding. Its silver fleets were threatened by Dutch and English raids. Its armies fought on too many fronts. And as French gold poured into the war, Spain's enemies found new strength. The stage was set for a clash that would decide more than just a battle. It would decide whether the Habsburg dream of dominance could survive. May 19, 1643. Near the small French town of Rocroi, destiny arrived. The Spanish tercios marched in, proud and confident, their reputation legendary. Facing them was a French army led by an unlikely commander, the Duke of Enghien, only 21 years old, untested in such a moment. Yet history often crowns the bold. At dawn, cannon fire thundered. Smoke rolled over the fields. Spanish infantry advanced, their iron discipline holding formation against French assaults. For hours, the tercios stood unbroken, their walls of pikes repelling charge after charge. But Enghien gambled. He hurled his cavalry against the Spanish flanks, wheeling behind their lines, striking with ferocity. At last, the tercios cracked. What followed was slaughter. Thousands of Spaniards fell, their proud formations shattered. The myth of Spanish invincibility was broken at Rocroi. For the Habsburgs, it was a shock that echoed across Europe. For France, it was triumph, a signal that the tide of power had turned. Rocroi was not the only turning point. Across the continent, momentum shifted. In Germany, Wallenstein, once the empire's greatest commander, had grown too ambitious. His wealth, his arrogance, and his secret dealings with enemies alarmed Ferdinand. In 1634, Wallenstein was accused of treason. That winter, assassins entered his chamber and struck him down, ending his stormy life with steel. With Wallenstein gone, imperial command faltered. Though victories still came, the cohesion of Ferdinand's cause began to unravel. The war became a whirlpool of betrayal and survival. Protestant princes bargained with Catholic kings. Catholic states struck deals with Protestant allies. Soldiers cared nothing for cause, only for coin. Even at its turning points, the war never forgot its cruelty. The victories of generals meant little to the peasants who watched their homes burn. Letters from survivors speak of villages where nothing moved but crows, where wells were filled with corpses, where fields lay bare for years. A chronicler in Thuringia wrote, "It is as if the wrath of God himself has descended. No one is spared, neither child, nor woman, nor the old. The earth drinks blood as rain." By the 1640s, vast stretches of Germany were depopulated. Some regions lost half their people. Others lost more than three-quarters. Hunger and plague stalked those who lived, leaving them gaunt shadows of humanity. And yet, kings continued their games. The 30 Years' War had begun as a revolt in Bohemia, a question of religion and rights. By the mid-1640s, it had become something greater, and darker. It was a struggle for the soul of Europe itself. The Protestant cause had been saved by Sweden and France. The Habsburg dream of Catholic hegemony was broken. Yet the war had not ended. It dragged on, a war of exhaustion, a war where no side dared yield for fear of losing everything. Still, Rocroi had revealed the truth: Spain was fading, France was rising, and the balance of power in Europe would never again be the same. But even as armies triumphed, Europe itself was collapsing. Cities burned, dynasties faltered, and the land groaned under 30 years of blood. The fall was coming. By the mid-1640s, the 30 Years' War was no longer a struggle of faith or even a victory. It was a war of survival, and survival was failing. Armies still marched, banners still rose, but behind the drums and trumpets lay a continent broken beyond recognition. Fields were empty, cities hollow, and people too weak even to bury their dead. Europe was collapsing. For nearly 3 decades, the war had devoured everything. Generals had come and gone, alliances shifted like sand, and kings had gambled with the lives of millions. Yet the war dragged on, not out of glory, but out of fear. No side dared surrender, the Habsburgs clung to their empire. Sweden and France pressed their advantage. Smaller states fought simply to avoid annihilation. And so, armies still clashed, though the victories meant little. Battles were fought, but nothing changed except the growing list of the dead. By now, the land itself was as dangerous as any enemy. Crops had failed, not from poor harvests, but from decades of soldiers trampling fields, burning granaries, and slaughtering livestock. In Saxony, villagers were found eating straw and weeds. In Bavaria, entire communities fled to forests, building huts among trees to escape marauding soldiers. In Swabia, people dug up graves for scraps of clothing or wood. Hunger was no longer the shadow of war, it was its commander. Some armies even used famine as strategy. They burned villages not just for plunder but to starve their enemy. What began as a rebellion over religion had become a war fought by destroying the very people who once sustained it. Even soldiers, hardened by years of killing, began to break. Unpaid, Unfed, many deserted. Others turned on their commanders. In 1647, a mutiny erupted among imperial troops in Bavaria. Hungry, exhausted men refused to fight, threatening their officers with death unless they received food and coin. Similar revolts broke out in Swedish and French camps. The armies were not loyal armies anymore, they were gangs, mercenaries, survivors clinging to scraps. One chronicler wrote, "It is not war, but chaos. Soldiers fight for whoever feeds them. They wear no colors but hunger." The war's closing years brought no mercy to Europe's towns. Cities burned not as symbols of conquest, but as bargaining chips in negotiations that dragged on endlessly. In Würzburg, plague swept through the ruins. In Mainz, refugees crowded into streets, carrying little but rags. In countless towns, bells that once rang for festivals now tolled only for funerals. The once proud city of Württemberg was described by a traveler, "I saw nothing but smoke and silence. The houses stood, but no voices came. Wolves prowled the streets." Even when armies moved on, the land remained dead. The great dynasties themselves staggered under the weight of the war. Spain, once Europe's mightiest empire, now bled from every vein, its fleets harried, its armies broken, its silver drained. Austria, though still powerful, was crippled by the cost of endless campaigns. France, though victorious on battlefields, was stretched thin, its people weary of taxes and conscription. Sweden, hailed once as savior, had sunk deep into debt, its king long dead, its armies far from home. The 30 Years' War had ground down not only the people, but the crowns themselves. By 1646, the cries for peace grew too loud to ignore. Yet even peace was difficult. Each side demanded too much, feared too much, distrusted too much. Negotiations dragged on in the Westphalian cities of Münster and Osnabrück. As diplomats argued in gilded halls, soldiers still starved in muddy camps, and peasants still died nameless in the fields. It would take years of wrangling, bargaining, and betrayal before a treaty could be signed. But at last, the leaders realized the truth. There was nothing left to gain. Only ruins remained. By 1648, the war was over. Not with a decisive battle, but with exhaustion. The Peace of Westphalia was signed, ending 30 years of slaughter. Borders were redrawn, powers adjusted, religions grudgingly tolerated. The map of Europe shifted forever. But nothing could redraw the lives already lost. Across Germany, entire villages had disappeared. Populations were cut in half. In some regions, only a quarter of the people survived. Generations of children had grown up knowing nothing but hunger, smoke, and the sound of drums. For them, peace was not triumph. It was silence. The guns fell silent in 1648. But what remained was not victory, nor glory. It was ashes, and from those ashes, Europe would be reborn in ways no one could yet imagine. The year is 1648. The cannons are quiet, the drums are still. For the first time in 30 years, Europe breathes without the stench of powder. But what remained was not peace, it was ruin. Germany, the war's crucible, was scarcely recognizable. Towns that had stood for centuries lay in ashes. Villages were erased from maps. Roads once filled with merchants and pilgrims were now haunted by beggars and wolves. Travelers wrote of silence so deep it felt unnatural. Forests swallowed abandoned farms. Churches stood with shattered windows, their bells stolen for cannon metal, their pews used as firewood. Entire families had vanished. Generations lost. In some regions, only 1 in 4 people remained alive. Others were cut by half. The survivors were gaunt, hollow-eyed, speaking in whispers of famine, plague, and soldiers who left nothing but bones behind. Historians would later struggle to count the dead. Was it 4 million? 8? No one truly knew. Records were gone, graves unmarked. All that could be said was this: the 30 Years' War was one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history, and perhaps the most destructive ever seen on German soil. The death toll was not only in battle. For every man slain by musket or pike, far more died of hunger, plague, or exposure. War had not only killed, it had starved, burned, and consumed. Letters from survivors capture the human wreckage. A widow in Franconia wrote, "I buried 6 children. I buried my husband. I buried neighbors and friends until I could no longer dig. Now I wait only for my own turn." Another chronicler described women searching fields for bones to grind into meal, children with bellies swollen from famine, villages where the living envied the dead. Yet even in this devastation, kings and diplomats carved new borders. The Peace of Westphalia reshaped Europe's map. Switzerland and the Dutch Republic emerged independent, free of imperial chains. France gained Alsace, strengthening its frontier. Sweden carved lands along the Baltic, rising as a northern power. The Holy Roman Empire, once a dream of unity, was left a hollow shell, hundreds of states more independent than before. The Habsburgs, though still powerful, had been checked. Their vision of a Catholic Europe was dead. Instead, the principle of cuius regio, ius religio, the ruler decides the faith, was reaffirmed, cementing the religious patchwork of the continent. Westphalia was not only peace. It was precedent. It marked the birth of modern diplomacy, of sovereignty, of nations negotiating their fate at the table rather than the battlefield. But to the common people, these treaties meant little. They did not redraw hunger. They did not resurrect the dead. For those who endured, memory was a heavier burden than any treaty. Old men told children of days when villages were alive with song. Mothers rocked babies with lullabies of sorrow, recalling husbands lost to war. Priests led prayers not for victory, but for endurance. A pastor in Hesse wrote, "The war is ended, but the scars remain. Not on our fields alone, but on our souls. We shall never forget the sound of armies, nor the silence that followed them." The war had stripped away illusions of glory. It left behind a vision of what unchecked ambition, cloaked in religion, could unleash. The 30 Years' War did not end with triumph. It ended with exhaustion, compromise, and grief. And yet, from these ashes, Europe would rise anew. Dynasties fell, borders shifted, philosophies grew. Thinkers like Thomas Hobbes, watching the chaos, concluded that without order, life was nasty, brutish, and short. Statesmen learned that power must be balanced, lest one empire consume all. But for the peasants who had lived through it, there was only one lesson: war devours. The 30 Years' War left Europe scarred. But from its wounds came new ideas, new orders, and new warnings about ambition and cruelty. lessons written not in ink, but in blood. The guns of the 30 Years' War fell silent in 1648. But the echoes carried far beyond that year, far beyond Germany, and far beyond the graves it left behind. This was not simply a war of kings and crowns. It was a mirror, showing humanity what it becomes when ambition is boundless and faith is wielded as a weapon. The war began with sermons and banners, with cries of faith and righteousness. Catholics fought to restore their church, Protestants to defend their freedom. But as the decades bled away, faith became masked, and ambition stood revealed. Behind every holy word were crowns seeking land, dynasties clawing for survival, empires chasing power. The war taught Europe, brutally, that religion could ignite a blaze, but politics and greed would feed its fire until nothing remained. And when the fire finally burned out, it was not theology that shaped the peace, but diplomacy. The Peace of Westphalia enshrined sovereignty, the right of rulers to govern without outside interference. It marked the birth of the modern nation-state. The lesson was clear: endless war destroys all. Balance of power, negotiation, restraint, these became the new weapons of Europe. The philosophers of the age looked into the abyss and tried to understand. Thomas Hobbes, watching the horror unfold from England, wrote that without strong order, life was nothing but chaos. His vision of the Leviathan, a sovereign to prevent men from tearing each other apart, was born from the screams of Germany. Others saw the war as proof that conscience must be free, that faith cannot be imposed by blade or decree. Slowly, painfully, Europe edged toward toleration, not out of generosity, but out of exhaustion. Yet the memory of the 30 Years' War remained a scar across centuries. For generations, peasants told stories of soldiers who stripped their homes, of winters when children starved, of villages that disappeared forever. Even in later wars, the Napoleonic campaigns, the World Wars, Germans remembered the desolation of the 17th century. It was a warning, whispered across time: this is what happens when war becomes life itself. The 30 Years' War was not only a conflict of its age. It was a lesson for every age. It mattered because it ended the dream of one universal empire in Europe. It mattered because it forced states to find balance instead of domination. It mattered because it showed, more clearly than ever before, that civilians, not kings, not generals, pay the highest price. And it mattered because it proved that no matter how powerful armies may be, no war can last forever. Exhaustion, hunger, and grief will force men to stop, even if only when there is nothing left to take. The 30 Years' War was not simply a chapter in history. It was a turning point, a passage from medieval faith and empire to modern nation and state. But it was also a graveyard. A graveyard of lives, of villages, of illusions. From its ashes, Europe would rise again. But the legacy of the 30 Years' War would linger, in borders, in politics, in philosophy, and in memory. Its shadow would shape the world we live in still. The 30 Years' War ended in 1648 with treaties inked in Münster and Osnabrück, but wars do not end on paper, they end in memory. And the memory of this war was carved into Europe like a scar. The Peace of Westphalia redrew the map. The Dutch Republic and Switzerland were confirmed independent, free from the empire's shadow. France emerged stronger, rising toward the dominance it would wield in the 18th century. Sweden carved new power in the north. The Holy Roman Empire, once envisioned as a single Christian order, was left hollow. Its princes held their own authority. Its emperor's crown glittered, but it no longer commanded. The dream of a united Christendom was gone forever. What rose in its place was something new, the system of sovereign states. Boundaries mattered. Balance of power mattered. Diplomacy mattered. It was, in many ways, the birth of the modern international order. But treaties cannot erase hunger. They cannot resurrect the dead. For the common people, the war left only absence. Fields untended. Villages never rebuilt. Families broken beyond repair. The population of Germany fell by millions. In some regions, entire communities simply ceased to exist. Survivors carried the trauma forward. They remembered the wolves in abandoned towns, the starving winters, the mercenaries who knew no God but hunger. Their stories would echo for centuries, reminders of what unchecked ambition can do to ordinary lives. And yet, from this suffering, ideas were born. The war convinced thinkers that conscience could not be forced. Toleration became not a gift, but a necessity. States learned that negotiation could preserve what endless fighting destroyed. The philosopher Hobbes, staring into the abyss, argued that only strong order could prevent chaos. Others would later argue the opposite, that liberty and conscience must be protected to prevent tyranny. From the ashes of the 30 Years' War, modern political thought began to take shape. The 30 Years' War was not the last great conflict of Europe. But it was a warning to all that followed. It showed the world that wars born of faith can become wars without meaning, that ambition dressed in holy colors can still devour millions. It was the war that ended the Middle Ages in spirit, and began the modern age in blood. Its shadow remains with us still. The 30 Years' War was Europe's descent into hell that it ended not in victory, but in exhaustion, not with triumph, but with silence. From its ashes rose the Europe we know today, sovereign states, diplomacy, modern war, modern thought, but its legacy is a warning. When ambition and belief fuse into fire, the world itself can burn. And if this was Europe's bloodiest war, what came next would shake the world to its core. Subscribe, because the next story will leave you speechless.